right, ladies and gentlemen, a pleasant good morning, good afternoon, good night, whatever time of the day it is, whichever part of the world you are, that time of the day. Hello. Let me say thank you very much to everyone for being here today with us, for being a part of this United Nations Decade of Action in regards to our Indigenous brothers and sisters around the world. Thank you very much to all of you for bracing us with your presence to be here. Thank you very much to all of our wonderful speakers, to you, our viewers here with us on Zoom, as well as watching us live on Facebook, whichever part of the world you are. Thank you very much for taking the time out from your busy schedule today to be a part of this event today. We will be focusing on addressing quality and inclusive education in Indigenous community across the world, and as well as the flagging of Get on Board for SDG 10-year search campaign. I want to go ahead and just give you guys a brief statement that was given by the UN General Secretary last year. It says there are an estimated 370 million Indigenous people in the world. A significant portion still lack basic rights, with systemic discrimination and exclusion continuing to threaten ways of life, cultures, and identities. This is contrary to the intent of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People and the 2030 Agenda of Sustainable Development, with its promise to leave no one behind. I love that part, the promise to leave no one behind. I count on member states to engage and support Indigenous people in determining their own development through policies that are inclusive, equitable, and accessible. The United Nations stands ready to support all initiatives aimed at realizing the rights and aspiration of Indigenous people. So the COVID-19 has created overall disruption on global development from the local community, affecting human personality and well-being. Overall systems are disrupted, including school systems, yet education is the most paramount foundation for societal progress. Global interconnection and massive influence enacting action on new era of engagement through dialogue agenda. Digital disruption, learning platform, and best practices for re-engineering, creating professionalism and critical thinking, build strong network and global partnerships, and establish knowledge sharing and best practices across the world must be enabled to encourage new models. Campaigns and initiatives for providing education across all levels of education, especially in Indigenous community. With the Decade of Action, committed efforts are geared towards ensuring that national development is achieved in all sectors of humanity. On these spirited persons have stepped up action through various campaigns of interest to commit to the Decade of Action and establishing action on 5 Ps. In our commitment to the Decade of Action and in continuation of Center of SDG Global Education USA concern to quality and inclusive education for lifelong learning for community classrooms, we have become concerned about the education in Indigenous communities. Considering the outcomes from the World Indigenous Peoples Conference on Education in 2017 at Ontario, Canada, on the 2017 team, a celebration of resilience, the role and impacts of Indigenous education in truth and reconciliation around the world. Our organization, in partnership with MACBAN Arts, took to a discussion on theme addressing quality and inclusive education in Indigenous community across the world, to re-echo the call of the United Nations Secretary General Antonio to the decade of action and the 5 Ps of the 2030 agenda. So with that being said, I want to step aside for a little bit so that you can hear from our speakers today, who will be speaking to us on a myriad of points and areas that will help us to better understand, and at the same time give us solutions, give us ways in which we can be able to help curb and be a voice to the Indigenous community and help as well. So our first speaker will be speaking on quality and inclusive education beyond COVID-19 era. He is Dr. Joel Gongaza de Souza. He is the UN physician, United Nations Medical Service in New York. So Dr. Joel de Souza, over to you, sir.
Okay, good morning. I'm very happy and to participate, to contribute with informations and about this so important discussion about indigenous education. And I want to say thanks to Robert, to Judith for the invitation, and to talk about my experience between 20 years inside of Amazon area, specifically Roraima state, and the border with Guyana and Venezuela. I'm working all the time with Yanomamis people. You know, the Yanomamis is the maybe the more isolated indigenous people in the world. But here have another indigenous people, about 500,000 of indigenous people in my state, in Brazil, in north of Brazil. Then I introduced my friend Everton, that helped me in my English, to help me to explain more easy in Portuguese, to give for you better information. Understand? Okay. Sorry, because I'm very busy here. All the time I'm working with the COVID special epidemic and with this important mission, and I don't have so enough time to train my English. I needed to improve my English, and I say thanks for you for the comprehension. Bem, beginning started about in Portuguese my conversation. Bom, a primeira questão é que eu vou convidar vocês todos para vir conhecerem aqui a nossa realidade da Amazônia.
The first thing I would like to do is to invite you all to come and visit the Amazon area.
Porque para a gente traçar políticas públicas e pensar em projetos,
in order to plan public policies and projects,
nós precisamos conhecer as realidades dos povos indígenas.
We need to know the reality of these people.
E isso só se faz visitando pessoalmente.
The only way you can do that is by visiting personally the indigenous people here.
Dr. Robert Thomas e doutora Judith estiveram aqui conhecendo o nosso trabalho com os Yanomamis.
Dr. Thomas and Dr. Judy were here to see a little bit of our work with the Yanomami people.
E a realidade de cerca de 50 mil indígenas no estado de Roraima.
In reality, 50,000 people indigenous people in the state of Roraima, which is north of Brazil.
E que não é diferente de 20 milhões de amazônidas.
Who are not different from the others, some 20 million people from the other areas in Brazil.
É a falta do acesso a uma educação de qualidade.
Is the lack of access to the education with quality.
E que respeite
and respect
a cultura de cada etnia.
and with respect their culture, their ethnic culture.
Mais de 100 na Amazônia, mais de 100 etnias diferentes.
Which there are more than 100 ethnic people in the Amazon.
Uma educação inclusiva
An inclusive education
que promova protagonismo,
which promotes protagonism, which promotes relationship,
poder econômico,
economic power,
mas que preserve as tradições e a cultura tradicional.
while preserving the culture and traditions.
Quando o indígena vem estudar na cidade, ele não tem mais acesso a estudar a sua cultura.
When one of members of these tribes come to town, they lose their culture. They cannot go back.
E o mundo, a civilização humana perde muito porque se perdem muitas informações de medicina tradicional.
And the urban people, the white people, as they say, lose a lot of information from the traditional medicine, which comes from the forest.
E a agricultura tradicional.
And the traditional agriculture as well.
Como sementes.
As a seed, as a base.
Milho.
I see. As seeds, as
frutas da Amazônia.
Fruits from the Amazon.
Que se perdem no tempo.
They lose it, as time goes by.
E o patrimônio de sementes, por exemplo.
And I would say, and to have the patrimony, the acquisition of seeds, for instance.
Sim, é importante destacar que existem algumas iniciativas dos próprios povos indígenas.
It's important to emphasize there are some initiatives from the indigenous people themselves
para promover uma melhor inclusão educacional,
to promote a better education,
como por exemplo,
for example,
a instalação de uma universidade,
the creation of a university,
international
university,
nas fronteiras,
in the borders,
de Brasil,
Venezuela
e Guiana,
and Guyana,
que pudesse atender todas as indígenas da região,
which would help all the indigenous people from the region,
e que pudesse ter a chancela
and having the
sponsorship, organismos multilaterais,
from multilateral organisms,
como a ONU.
The UN.
Destacar a importância não só de cursos universitários.
It's important to emphasize the importance of not only university studies,
mas cursos técnicos também.
As well as technical courses.
Aproveitando as oportunidades locais.
And this as well as having the opportunity
taking advantage of the local opportunity.
The local culture.
É impossível ter uma boa saúde.
It's impossible to have a good health
se não tem boa alimentação.
If you don't eat properly.
E alimentação só vem, uma boa alimentação só acontece.
And a good food.
Quando há geração de renda.
Only happens when you have income generation.
E para isso, supostamente, uma boa educação.
And for that you have to have a good education.
Nós temos aqui na nossa região muitos problemas com doenças metabólicas entre os indígenas.
We have here in our region many metabolic disease within the indigenous community.
Como diabetes e pressão alta.
As diabetes and high blood pressure.
Por uma má alimentação.
For lack of a good food.
E a educação, ela passa por coisas básicas.
And the education goes through basic things.
Como, por exemplo, o manejo do lixo.
As for example, how you're going to handle the
garbage.
The garbage.
As experiências locais, elas podem servir para projetos mundiais.
The local experience could help world projects.
Mas as especificidades locais têm que ser consideradas.
But the wow, it's quite difficult. Specificities, local specificities
Tem que ser respeitadas.
Might be respected.
Por exemplo,
For example,
os Yanomamis
the Yanomamis
estão a 1 hora de voo da capital Boa Vista, no mínimo.
1 hour flight from Boa Vista, at least.
Então é muito mais fácil.
So it's much easier
formar educadores
to prepare educators
Yanomamis, respeitando a sua cultura,
respect their own culture,
para que essa educação seja universalizada, alcance a todos.
For this kind of education be universal.
Grande problema que temos aqui,
a great problem we have over here,
é a falta de médicos
is the lack of doctors
e enfermeiros indígenas.
And nurses from the indigenous people.
White people, ou que não são indígenas, não conseguem se adaptar na cultura dessas comunidades.
Non-indigenous people cannot adapt themselves inside these communities.
E as comunidades acabam ficando desassistidas.
And the community remain without assistance.
A educação também, finalizando,
so the education
passa pelo combate ao preconceito, né?
Goes through the tackling the preconception.
Onde todos os indígenas, independente das suas culturas,
where all the indigenous, independent of their culture,
por mais diferentes que sejam das nossas, que vivemos na cidade,
the more different from the urban and theirs,
tem que ser respeitado.
Must be respected.
Essa é a minha contribuição.
That's my contribution.
Posso responder perguntas também sobre o trabalho.
Should you have any question, I can answer them. Please.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Joel. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, sir. That was very informative, and thanks for taking us back down memory lane. Because a lot of people, when you say where you like, for instance, I'm a Guyanese, and when we say I'm from Guyana, they say, "Oh, you're from Africa." They think we're talking about Ghana, but we're actually speaking about Ghana. So thank you very much for letting us know that, because yes, between Guyana, Suriname, Venezuela, Brazil, there's a lot of indigenous people over in that region. So thank you very much for giving us that, and for letting us know that, and for speaking to us on that area as well. Here next, we will be speaking to us on reimagining education to set up change for lifelong learning on the 2030 Agenda and the Indigenous Community. We have, where did my screen? Sorry. We have His Royal Highness Prince Andrew Williams, who will be speaking to us now.
Well, thank you so very much. I am Prince Andrew Williams Jr., recently inducted as a prince by the monarchy of Yaya and the monarchy of Igbo in Ghana. My mission is to actually uplift the peoples of Africa, of the Igbo continent, Igbo people, and all peoples worldwide. I'm also here as a representative of multiple organizations. I'm president of the 5 Points Youth Foundation here in Los Angeles, California. And as such, I am the chairperson of the Ad Hoc International Advisory Board of Goodwill Ambassadors, of which Princess Sheppy is one of our trusted and valued representatives. I speak here actually on behalf of royalty, uplifting the legacy of Kofi Annan, who was the Secretary General of the United Nations in 2000 that ushered in the Millennium Development Goals. As you may know, what we are now faced with with the Sustainable Development Goals is only an iteration of the Millennium Development Goals that set us out for a 1,000-year transition from the life we had to the world that we're faced with now. Indigenous people are not only crucial and critical to our being able to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, but it's necessary for royal, tribal, and indigenous leaders to work with interfaith, business, and neighborhood collaboratives in order to leave no one behind. You may know that the United States, unfortunately, pulled out of the Paris climate talks, but now with the new administration, we may be going back into it. But you have to uplift President Barack Obama, because it was he as president that signaled the joining of the United States to the ratification of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So one of the things that we're bringing to the table is a 50-year plan. This does not begin right now. And it was in fact the African Union in 2012 that focused on the 50-year plan for the African Union. Their efforts to create what was called the Common African Position, it actually was the largest contribution by a region into what we now know as the Sustainable Development Goals. So as we speak about indigenous peoples, let us understand that also includes tribal people as well, as there are over 3,000 tribes on the continent of Africa. But we're also faced with, as you know, the current pandemic, but also a transition to what the World Economic Forum calls the fourth industrial revolution. As far as our education is concerned, it's our responsibility to make sure that our youth and our children themselves are fully involved and able to engage with this new paradigm shift that we're faced with. So what we're delivering are solutions that anyone can use anywhere around the world. One of our sponsors is ASTEAMvillage.org. You'll see that I'm representing here the Encounter think tank. There is an Encounter Kansas City, and its founder, William Wells, is providing this ASTEAMvillage.org that anyone on Earth, any child on Earth that has an ability to reach the digital universe can get online training and tutorials about the educational, vocational, and entrepreneurial resources that they can use right now today to engage with their local and global communities. So we offer this as a free resource for anyone in the world for us to take this opportunity to connect together our worlds and our peoples. Speaking personally here in Los Angeles, it's my leadership role in Encounter think tank from 2012 that led to my joining the United Nations Global Compact. This too is what Kofi Annan founded back in 2000. However, it was in a response to the adverse and sometimes deadly effect that the world's corporations and their activities had on what you call undeveloped areas, indigenous areas, as well as, of course, underserved populations. So it has now grown into the largest corporate social responsibility organization in the world, from a minimum of 40 in 2000 now to over 10,000. So I'm here to ask each of you who are members of the civil society, that includes nonprofits, non-governmental organizations, labor associations, business associations, educational institutions, cities and municipalities, to join our campaign to register another 10,000 new members of the United Nations Global Compact, for the simple reason that together we can, I believe, mobilize ourselves with our own strength and resources, so we're not dependent upon foreign aid or resources, even from our governmental organizations. At the end of the day, it's up to us as individuals in our own households, in our own communities, to find ways to bridge the gap so we can all work together to build a worldwide community resiliency network. Speaking again to education, it is critically important that we understand that the herbal trainings and indigenous medicines that we're making available to the world are in fact critical, but we have to use today's technology to close that gap. Another example is AfyaRecord.com. They're based in Kenya, but they're delivering now worldwide solutions so that every individual can become the owner of their own health data. And any health facility in the world can be able to get access to that information. That's particularly true of our rural populations. So it's critically important that we understand when we speak about educating our indigenous communities, that the education is not limited to reading, writing, and arithmetic. They have to also understand the cultural implications of who they are and the value that these children have. Again, here in Los Angeles, we're also the home of, unfortunately, what's now known as rap music, right? Which is an iteration of hip hop music, but it is in fact music and as a universal language that can best reach our children. When you look at Africa, where the population, over 50% of the population is less than 30 years old, it is music, in fact, that reaches them. So we have to take a more positive action to utilize the tools that we already have that work. For example, right here in Los Angeles, every year we do what's called Thanksgiving. And the idea is that we transition from the previous celebration of, let's say, Columbus Day, et cetera. Here in Los Angeles, we switched that to Indigenous Day, right? But when you think about Thanksgiving, your thoughts are about pilgrims. We've converted that to Thanksgiving. And the idea is that from a spiritual standpoint, we have to be forgiving and loving of ourselves and our planet and understand how those connect together. On the screen, you'll see, I hope, the sponsors that are supporting this initiative to bring together solutions. The EdFu Foundation, based in Oakland, California, is based upon the premise, as you may know. First, let me take a sidestep. EdFu is a city in Egypt that has the oldest known temple of Horus. And so when the founder, Sheldon Williams, had a daughter in 1999, he wanted to make sure she understood that we are all indigenous to the earth. So we're all one family. So we all have to take the responsibility for each other. That doesn't fall to anyone else except ourselves. So the EdFu Foundation is where you can find activities that will link you to ASTEAM Village, to the Revelation Network, to the 5 Points Youth Foundation. And we're offering that opportunity to each of you to join our campaign to collaborate together moving forward. I look forward to answering any questions that you may have, and you'll find all the information available to you in the chat. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you, thank you, thank you. That was very, very informative, and we look forward to more from you. As the two previous speakers said, if anyone have any questions, feel free to put your questions in the Q&A section. There's a Q&A section. It'll be great if you can put your questions there. It's easier for me to grab. If you put it in the chat, there's a lot of messages coming through the chat, so I wouldn't be able to grab it that easily. But in the Q&A, I can easily grab it. Thank you very much, His Royal Highness Prince Andrew Williams, for speaking to us on the Reimagine Education to set up change for lifelong learning. Next, we have speaking to us on reimagining Indigenous rights to health and community development and decade of action. Next, we have Professor Dr. Judith Thomas. She is the ambassador of WULMI to the United Nations for Geneva, member organization for human rights, Defense Romania. So Ambassador Professor Dr. Judith Thomas, please go ahead.
Good day, Your Excellencies, distinguished ambassadors. It's an honor and a privilege to be here presenting and discussing current issues with Indigenous communities under United Nations Decade of Action. I'm a registered nurse and a registered clinical counselor working for the past 9 years with the Indigenous communities in Northern Ontario, Canada. As a disclaimer, I will be using the term Indigenous peoples because around the world, some may find the use of the word Native offensive. The Sustainable Developmental Goals, SDG, is important to have as a framework which is an integral part of humanitarian efforts to support and sustain Indigenous peoples. The government, including the private sector and civil society, can implement projects that benefit the Indigenous peoples, specifically to fight justice, inequality, and poverty, things that the general population are entitled to. These agencies also have the power to eradicate the stereotypes and judgments of Indigenous people who have experienced discrimination on a regular, sometimes daily basis. While there are many issues to consider, I will now focus on 3 issues that I've encountered while working amongst Indigenous communities, which when solved will contribute as a solution pathway to the other situations and issues. Marginalization and discrimination, poverty, and emotional well-being. Marginalization and discrimination. In the past 10 years or more, there have been many incidences where the bodies of Canadian Native peoples were found in Thunder Bay, Ontario River. These include adult males, females, and students who have similar issues heard recently in the media of Black people being brutalized, targeted, and killed by police. We must also recognize that Indigenous communities in Canada are also experiencing similar issues. As cited by the CBC, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, police have found to conduct poor investigations, usually citing no evidence of foul play or what they refer to as, in quotes, drunk Indians, end quote. I have encountered many incidences in my role as a nurse and counselor where I have been made aware of such situations. Poverty. I've encountered extreme situations, for example, families living in condemned homes, in houses that have no toilets, no plumbing infrastructure or heating, using stove and firewood. Emotional well-being. There are issues such as high drug use, depression, and suicide rates. These 3 aforementioned issues comprise area that the United Nations Declaration for Indigenous Peoples deals with, and in addition to the following, which align with the United Nations SDGs. 1, economic growth. 2, women's empowerment and women's health. 3, reduce the inequalities and issues for people with disabilities. 4, goals should be inclusive where their input is acknowledged. 5, global education should be culturally relevant. 6, women's health are some concerns. 7, equality and its importance. 8, recognizing Indigenous contribution to SDGs. And 9, being connected to their lands, language, and culture. Now, solutions to obtain these goals. Number 1 and 2 are tied in together because if you increase economic growth by implementing programs that will improve awareness, self-awareness of their abilities to sustain themselves, such as what the older generation has done by being able to live off the land by hunting, fishing, and bird slaying, and utilizing natural medicines used for natural agricultural resources. These will help to reduce poverty. Women's empowerment and women's health, such as issues with malnutrition. The first would be to encourage women to continue in their leadership roles as chiefs in their communities, and other examples would be to provide continual education programs, also establishing and maintaining educational programs that will empower and support their culture, where women will continue to hunt wildlife, create traditional crafts, including artwork and sculpting, having them pass these skills on to the next generation. Reducing inequalities and issues that people with disabilities experience by providing accessibility to healthcare and self-empowerment. All goals should be inclusive. Where the input is of Indigenous people, they should be acknowledged always. Global education should be culturally relevant to enable Indigenous people to embrace the benefits of education and skills acquisition to be able to compete effectively with our ever-changing world. Women's health is a major concern where women are looked at last due to being female and not well and poor, forgetting that without women, no community can be built and sustained. This is specifically true for Indigenous communities. It is important for women to be treated equally, which can eradicate these issues. And 7, recognizing Indigenous contribution to sustainable developmental goals. These are all a part of the suggested solutions. Sustainable developmental goals. As per United Nations, the following SDGs are relatable and important to Indigenous peoples, not just in Canada, but around the world. Finding new strategies and implementing them, which includes their culture, will help to sustain peace and conflict resolution on a global scale. This will be locally and globally. Also promoting good health and well-being, both physically and mentally, are vital to achieve SDGs. In summary, United Nations SDGs resolve between now and 2030 the following. 1, end poverty and hunger everywhere to combat inequalities within and among countries. In Canada, ISC, Indigenous Services Canada, continue to support people living on Canadian reservations and by giving access to free healthcare, financial support for daily living and transportation, because some communities require flying in or driving on the winter roads in order to access their community. 2, building peaceful, just, and inclusive societies. The Canadian government continually supports their Indigenous people by giving them a voice in their governmental decision pertaining to them. 3, protect human rights and promote gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls. People have a right to necessity of life, and the Canadian Human Rights Act of 1977 protects their people from discrimination. 4, ensure the lasting protection of the planet and its natural resources. Reducing methane emissions from Canadians' oil and gas sector to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, conserve natural gas, and create healthier communities. Canada invested $21.9 billion in green infrastructure to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, deliver clean air and safe drinking water, and promote renewable power since June 5th, 2017. Canada has put this in place to protect their resources. 5, we resolve also to create conditions for sustainable, inclusive, and sustained economic growth, shared prosperity, and decent work for all, taking into account different levels of national development and capacities. The interventions mentioned above are only a fraction of what needs to be done here in Canada, locally and internationally. As we move forward towards obtaining these sustainable developmental goals, we will succeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Thomas. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And thank you very much for your service as a first responder in this time, and then serving at the same time, serving the Indigenous people during the time of the COVID. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you. And at the same time for letting us know of these cases and matters. At this time, we're going to move to the vehicle of delivery. So fasten your seatbelt. We will now be looking at sustaining the decade of action and the commitment from global to local communities, which is the flagging of the Get on Board for SDG 10-year surge. The 10 years after the adoption of the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, progress in several countries has been made in formally recognizing Indigenous peoples, but overwhelmingly, they continue to face discrimination, marginalization, and major challenges in enjoying their basic rights. While Indigenous people have made significant advancements in advocating in advocating for their rights in international and regional fora, implementation of the declaration is impeded by persisting vulnerability and exclusion, and particularly among Indigenous women, children, youths, and persons with disabilities. Set forte UN system entities and other international organizations in a joint statement issued on the occasion of the International Day of the World's Indigenous People, marked annually on August 9th. The declaration, which was adopted by the UN General Assembly on September 13th, 2007, establishes a universal framework of minimum survival standards for the dignity and well-being of the world's indigenous peoples. It is the most comprehensive international instrument on indigenous peoples' collective rights, including the rights to self-determination, traditional standards, and lands and culture. So the Declaration on Indigenous Rights stands as beacon of progress. The declaration, which took more than 20 years to negotiate, stands today as a beacon of progress, a framework for reconciliation and a benchmark of rights. Underscored Victoria Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Miriam Wallet, chairperson of the UN Permanent Forum of Indigenous Issues, and the expert mechanism of the rights of Indigenous peoples in a joint statement on the day. But a decade on, we need to acknowledge the vast challenges that remain. In too many cases, Indigenous people are now facing even greater struggles and rights violations than they did 10 years ago, they added. Although some countries have taken constitutional and legislative measures to recognize their rights and identities, exclusion, marginalization, and violences continue to be widespread. Within this mind, Irina Bukova, Director General of the UN Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization under UNESCO, said that as custodians and practitioners of unique cultures and relationships with the natural environment, Indigenous peoples embody a wide range of linguistics and cultural diversity at the heart of our shared humanity. Protecting their rights and dignity is protecting everyone's rights and respecting humanity's soul, past and future, she said, noting that UNESCO latest Global Education Monitoring Report provides concrete guidance and policy advice for the advancement of Indigenous people's rights. On these, I would like to introduce to you His Serene Highness, Prince Nicholas, who has considered to worthwhile in recognition of the rights of Indigenous people, especially to education, to launch his philanthropic humanitarian support for the Indigenous people to ignite action for unstoppable movement on the UN Decade of Action as declared in 2019 by the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres. So at this time, coming to speak to us on sustaining the Decade of Action and commitment for global to local, from global to local communities, with the flagging of this with the flagging of the Get on Board for SDG 10-year surge, I would like to introduce to you His Serene Highness Prince Nikolai I, the Principality of Seborga.
Thank you very much. Greetings, our dignitaries, honorable assembly. First of all, I would like to thank the United Nations and the initiators of this conference who allow me to express myself on a subject close to my heart. As a preamble, I would like to remind us that in 1924, Chief Cayuga Descae went to Geneva to make the voice of Indigenous peoples heard in the League of Nations. so that a concept of indigenous rights could be born in 1957 and introduced the first international legal instrument relating to the protection and integration of indigenous populations in independent countries, which was updated in 1989 by the Indigenous and Tribal Peoples Convention. The UN Permanent Forum is the fruit of decades of hard work after the rapporteurs delivered their studies on the indigenous human condition. I'm thinking in particular of José Martinez Cobo, who gave the United Nations a rousing summons to act on their behalf. Then, in 1933, the United Nations proclaimed the International Year of the World's Indigenous Peoples, and calls were made for the creation of this permanent forum that would be able to address the concerns and interests of indigenous peoples, but also their rights, including the right of peoples to self-determination. It was precisely this question, this fundamental human reason, I would say, that appealed to me and was at the origin of the creation of the nation state that I represent. I believe in humanity for a better existence for all, and I am committed to a movement that encourages human participation to be more resourceful in building the future. Supporting peoples with empathy has been my core belief and mission for years. Moreover, I would say my leitmotif concerning the universe to bond humanity and sustainable development while reflecting the local and indigenous communities. I have met representatives of populations, young people, men and women, who have shared me their problems on human rights, discrimination, on their feelings of marginalization from social life, such as health, education, culture, sport, and in terms of resources, water and energy in general, without to speak about political and civil rights they lack, and put them in a position of inequality and injustice regarding the human rights to which every human ought to have. In addition, the rights of indigenous peoples' lands and territories is not always respected, despite their right to own and use it for their subsistence, both for their pharmacopoeia and their work. Yes, their major concerns are in these areas of health, education, and justice. And on this last point, the indigenous peoples that I have met have all raised the problem of tenure and security of the lands they occupy. And for some, they are going to jail for violation of territories because the land is usually allocated for logging and other companies or declared as reserves. We also all agree that education and healthcare should be more accessible to all. In this regard, and to go further, the General Secretary of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, has called for a movement that triggered the 2030 Agenda for a decade-long action plan that has took my full attention and my full support. The United Nations Development Agenda appealed to me because rooted in the 5P, namely people, planet, peace, prosperity, and partnership, an action plan totally in line with my vision of humanity. First, people highlight an important consideration for children, youth, and women in communities and cultures all around the world. Two, planet, the global community in consideration of indigenous and cultural groups from local to global, and of course, the health of our shared planet. Three, peace, providing resources for peaceful existence and cohabitation among citizens of indigenous and cultural groups. For prosperity, meeting the challenges of a sustainable future through education, initiatives, and campaigns. And finally, 5, partnership, build a global network for the development of human capacities and work in harmony to achieve lasting successes for humanity. In addition, this development agenda ties in with the certain idea that I have of the world and re-engages my philanthropic actions while focusing on the 5P. I would say that the United Nations Decade of Action inspired me to launch a campaign by addressing quality and inclusive education in indigenous communities. This campaign, entitled Get on Board for SDG 10-Year Surge, calls on stakeholders to invest and support education and encourage partnerships to promote, protect, and generate movements for the development of human capacities in indigenous communities. This campaign is indeed dedicated to defending the program established by the General Secretary to promote inclusive action, highlighting indigenous groups, and to promote access to quality education for all the children of the world, boys and girls, and empower them to reach their highest potential. To do this, the nation state of the Principality of Seborga has set up a social network called DECCHAT, totally based on cooperation in order to establish a base of exchanges allowing indigenous people to assert their civil and political rights, to protect their culture and their means of subsistence, to exchange views in terms of development or socio-economic projects, or in terms of indigenous cultural, intellectual, spiritual, and religious knowledge. In addition, the DECCHAT is a great platform for reconciliation workshops for the promotion of indigenous languages. And I recall the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous Peoples, which provides for the right of children to receive education in their own languages. The future we all face is one in which knowledge will be the most important exchange. Get on Board for SDG 10-Year Surge has been designed to be the standalone instrument at the forefront of reading and literacy of the SDGs, which can prove to be a gateway to communities, children, young people, governments, and actors in teaching and learning, but also an open door to the integration of knowledge in all fields for the benefit and service to the world. Also, I acknowledge the Minister of Foreign Affairs of New Zealand, Madame Nanaya Mauta, for whom I have deep admiration. The embarkation for Get on Board for SDG 10-Year Surge is already taking place to promote community, to create an intellectual environment where the future of sustainability, the universe of ideas, and the map of knowledge are in alignment with the decade of action. And I am already sure that many of you will take their boarding pass for a better world. Through this campaign, the Principality of Seborga is working to put in place its national policy to ensure its participation as other nations in the decade of action by promoting a global action that will contribute to the repositioning of the diplomatic status of nations. For this campaign, I am relying on the book Get on Board, the Children of the World, written by His Excellency Ambassador Denis Antoine, which the United Nations considers exceptional because it highlights the benefits of the SDGs for children of all ages as a testament to the movement of the campaign towards diplomatic communities and ethnic groups recognized by the United Nations. The campaign is the reason for book donation to diplomatic agencies and the indigenous communities to keep the momentum of the decade of action going full speed ahead, so the SDGs may be achieved as soon as possible. The decade of action has set the pace for development in all sectors and sparked a movement that can transform the face of the global community. I therefore reaffirm here my support for the United Nations and urge world leaders to listen and to get over their stubbornness in securing the development trend towards global transformation and for a future we all want. So get on board for the SDG 10-year surge, as I call on everyone to join me in meeting these challenges and ensuring that our ship can sail with serenity on this wave that will be successful by 2030. May my will also be yours, in the name of humanity, security, and freedom. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, sir. So consequently, His Serene Highness Nicholas I, global philanthropic humanitarian support and an imperative for SDG Decade of Action is a vital event linking the global humanitarian support of His Serene Highness Nicholas I with the indigenous people and their community to the call of the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres to the Decade of Action on 2030 agenda. His Highness considered the significant importance of the addressing quality and inclusive education in indigenous community, and took to contentiously invest in support of education by flagging a global campaign on Get on Board for SDG 10-year surge, to join the global community to mobilize for a decade of action in generating unstoppable movement for required transformation. In continuity, the campaign moves to create partnerships that promote, protect, and generate unrelenting commitment to quality and inclusive education for lifelong learning, as well as preserve indigenous prosperity. Thank you very much, thank you very much, His Serene Highness Nicholas I, for your commitment and your dedication here. Speaking to us on the call to action, commitment to Decade of Action, and the people of Indigenous Community, coming to speak to us is His Excellency Ambassador Dennis Antoine, Chair Advisory Board for Center for SDG Global Education USA. Ambassador Antoine, over to you, sir.
Good afternoon or good morning, wherever you may be. And let me salute distinguished Prince Nicholas. Thank you for your kind words. And my regards to all the panelists and our facilitating leader, Dr. Ada, and to you, Mr. Moderator. Now, what matters in Indigenous education is that we all get on board. And for that, the Prince's initiative is a demonstration that one man can energize a process, one philosophy can give it drive. Now, let us talk a little bit about Indigenous people's experience in education. It is and has been contentious one. From the onset, imposed by colonial-based education. And there has always been assimilation and segregation of Indigenous peoples from their communities and worldviews. Now, the history of education for Indigenous people, for example, has structural and sociological roots filled with marginalization and subjugation. So today, the improved state of education for Indigenous people has its foundations in the resiliency of Indigenous communities and social justice movement advocating for inclusion and change. So what is inclusion? Who are Indigenous people? What are the issues that face Indigenous people? How can education and reconceptualized how can education be reconceptualized to include Indigenous ways of knowing? And why should we care? I think the call to action to get on board. There are questions that will be examined throughout this 10-year surge. People for education in its meaning, what matters? That offers a body of research and for students and to gain competencies that provide a whole opportunity for change for those concerned with education to engage in conversation around what is important, the holistic development of our children, our youth around the world. So these same themes and conversations are what guide Indigenous communities in their commitment to lifelong learning for their peoples. Now, student achievement for Indigenous nations is based on birth to death continuum. That is the holistic approach to the process. So today I want to talk a little bit about a term that you would hear. What matters to Indigenous peoples in education is that children, youth, adults, and elders have opportunity to develop their gifts in a respectful space. It means that all community members are able to contribute to society, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, and are physically, emotionally, intellectually, and spiritually balanced. So the question again, what matters in Indigenous education? There is a term, holism. Now, what is holism? All, whole, entire, is an idea that various systems, for example, the physical, the biological, and the social, should be viewed as a whole, not merely collective parts. So holism, it came about since the 1920s, 1926, for example, when holism evolved. So the theory that parts of a whole are in intimate interconnection. And that's what we talk about holistic development. So implementing a vision committed to holism, diversity, and engagement explores an Indigenous approach to quality learning, an environment relevant to developing skills and competencies. It focuses on select work from people for education to draw upon and to use the concepts and put themes that align with Indigenous, determinations for education success. Therefore, I believe the initiative embraced by the Prince to seize the momentum for the next 10 years, but looking beyond, because 10 years is not very long. So 10 years beyond and beyond, because we're talking about lifelong and setting an environment, focusing on the planet, the people, prosperity, and of course, peace and partnership. So today I'm very pleased to be a part of this audience, this very prestigious presenters, to lend my voice and to indicate that when I had the vision to write this little document, Get on Board, Children of the World, it was indeed a call to action that preceded the global call to action from my little village, from my little the Indigenous spot. So today I am very honored that the Prince Nicholas and the distinguished Prince Andrew, and other dignitaries, Dr. Judith and others, have joined us and joining with Ada in bringing the voice of the village, the villages in the indigenous villages, bringing them together, reaching the world. I am very pleased to be a part of this occasion, and I thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. At this time, we will now move to our plenary session, value of quality and inclusive education in Indigenous community. Speaking to us from the African region, we have Dr. Godfrey Nenji, specialist, curriculum development and teachers education, technical and vocational education and training, Federal Technical Colleges of Education, Akoka Yaba, Lagos, Nigeria. So Dr. Godfrey, over to you, sir.
Yeah, thank you, moderator, Your Highnesses, Your Excellencies. I'm very happy to be part of this program. I am speaking to us from Nigeria. Let me just say that if there are any group of persons on this planet Earth that needs inclusive education, it is the indigenous people. Because without education, the indigenous people of the world will not be able to benefit from the benefit of education. Now, I'm speaking to us on value of quality and inclusive education for Africa region. There are a lot of indigenous communities in Africa, especially in Nigeria. And what we can do to help them is to make education inclusive for them. Now let's look at what inclusive education is. Inclusive education means that all learners, regardless of any challenges they may have, are placed in age-appropriate general education classes that are in their own neighborhood schools to receive quality instruction and support that enable them to meet success in the core curriculum. What does this imply? It means that we have to accept.
Sorry, Ambassador. Sorry, Doctor. Please, could you ask the folks in the background if they could please limit the noise, because the noise in the background is making it difficult for us to hear you.
Sorry about that. Sorry about that. This implies that we have to accept, understand the learners, and attending to the learners' differences and diversities, which can include physical diversity, cognitive diversity, academic diversity, social differences, and emotional diversity. Therefore, the driving principle to make all learners feel welcomed, appropriately challenged, and supported in their efforts. Why do we advocate for inclusive education for the indigenous persons? We advocate for inclusive education for the indigenous people of the world because, one, both the learner with and without disabilities benefit from inclusive education. Two, teachers provide instructions in a wider range of learning, which includes visual learning, auditory learning, kinesthetic learning, which benefits all categories of learners. Three, all learners are able to be part of their community and develop a sense of belonging and become better prepared for life in the community. Inclusive education provides all learners with opportunities to develop friendship with one another. It also makes sure that systems provide a better quality education for all learners and are instrumental in changing discriminatory attitudes. Now let's look at other aspects of inclusive education. How can we advance inclusive education? We can advance inclusive education for indigenous persons by ensuring that educators have the training and learning style. Two, to ensure that schools receive adequate and sustainable financial support so that all activities and services are fully inclusive. 3, we have to empower parents to assert their children's right to education in an inclusive setting. We also have to enable the entire community to work together and participate in the design, delivery, and monitoring of education, thereby reframing inclusive education as a shared responsibility. We also have to hold government accountable for implementing anti-discrimination legislation, legal mandate for inclusion, and policies to remove barriers. Now, what are the elements of basic inclusive education? The following are the elements of inclusive education that make it, if we want to make a success of inclusive education, we have to use teaching assistants or specialists who are very much well-grounded in the culture, in the religion, in the lives, in the tradition of the indigenous persons, to make sure that they teach these aspects of the life appropriately. 2, we have to make the curriculum inclusive. An inclusive curriculum implies that whatever the learners in the environment need to learn to make their life meaningful should be part of the curriculum. And then finally, we have to make sure that parents are involved in determining what should be taught to their wards and children in the indigenous communities. Now, let's move on to look at inclusive education and indigenous peoples of the world. Indigenous people are ethnic groups who are natives of a particular place on earth and live or lived in an interconnected relationship with the natural environment for many generations prior to the arrival of non-indigenous people. They are known for peculiar culture and tradition, which needs to be taught from generation to generation. There are a lot of indigenous population in Africa, and we have a lot of indigenous population in Nigeria as well. Education that is of value to them is one that is inclusive of their cultural, religious, emotional, traditional identity. Therefore, curriculum for indigenous education requires its users to acknowledge the existence of multiple forms of knowledge rather than one standard benchmark system. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Godfrey. At this time, we will now move to speaking to us on Indigenous women and youth, Her Royal Highness Princess Tespi, Managing Director of Naledi Tespi Business Consultancy, founder Future Lives Foundation, Vice President ADIO Network Southern Africa.
Thank you very much, Moderator Ambassador. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, all excellencies and highnesses. And I would like to say thank you to all the organizers, and thank you very much to Ambassador Andrew, and also to His Serene Highness, Prince Nicholas, for this initiative. And I look forward to working with him even further as we worked together with Ambassador Andrew on the cultural space or cultural institutions, or representing even the royals. And I thank you all. My presentation will be based on gender equality, based on the formal and informal education of women and girls in the traditional or indigenous societies. So I just would like to declare that when I say indigenous, when I say traditional, when I say rural, it's actually just one word that I will be using interchangeably. As we move forward, we have been speaking about the challenges which we know for decades have been existing. We have all spoken about them. And what I would like us today to do is, next year at this time, I would like us to be measuring the progress on the solutions. We have made presentations probably for more than we have seen ourselves, and also to showcase this decade of action. So I'm bringing to you the suggestions rather than all other challenges that we know. And I also have those challenges, but then let's talk about the suggested solutions to mitigate these challenges. And then I would also like just to quote that our Section 29 of our Constitution here in South Africa provides that everyone has the right, A, to basic education, including adult basic education, B, to further education, which the state, through reasonable measures, must make progressive, available, and accessible. We all have been talking about the accessibility of education for our rural people, women, and the marginalized groups. Let us face it, ladies and gentlemen, that most of the challenges are systematically created. And therefore, I would like to challenge each one of us to also be with me, to believe that we need to disrupt the system. And in disrupting the system, it needs courage. It needs all of us to say, now when we are putting action, when we are putting wheels to motion, it has to disrupt for us to see the changes. By finding a new home for development and progress, particularly in our continent, to demand the Africa we want. Probably we have been going softly, we have been putting suggestions, we have been putting all these presentations, but now it is for us, it is in our hands. As our former President Mandela said, so that now the baton is in our hands. How do we disrupt the system, you may be asking? And I smile because every time when you speak about disruption, everybody gets shaken and maybe even be unsettled in their seats. So therefore, let us move to the new home like the eagle disrupting its nest to get the eaglets out of their comfort home. Let us be uncomfortable so that there is a change. Come out of our comfortable zones. Okay, what can be done to ensure advancement of women and girls in formal and informal education, ultimately achieving the SDG by 2030, which is the 10 years, and also the Agenda 2063. Now, I would like to just also maybe on the lighter note to say, I don't know where will I be by 2063, but within this decade, let us all make that difference. And so by that doing, we would have also made an impact into the Agenda 2063. I hope you all agree, and you can put yes, yes, yes in your chat if you agree. My first point here, how do we do this disruption, is that we need more collaborative participation of indigenous or traditional structures in policymaking and budget allocations, where it directly and indirectly affects the indigenous or traditional structures. Thank you very much, Dr. Ada. There need to be concerted interventions targeted at the marginalized groups. Here we are talking about women, we are talking about children, and we are talking about the Black Africans and those living in the rural areas and people with little or no education, in order to ensure that we crush the enemy, which is poverty, at all levels, be it mentally, be it in mentally, which is our thinking, be it behaviorally, the greed that we see that causes corruption in our continent, and belief system. Sometimes even as people of Africa, we need to have confidence in our resources, in our abilities, in what we have. And if you agree, you can put again in your chat and say, yes, yes, I agree. My third point says to collaborate with organizations and philanthropies like we are saying today with His Serene Highness, aimed at skills development of women and people living with disabilities in the sectors of priority. We are talking about food security as it is currently. Now that is agriculture, tourism, and academic education system. If we can be able to change that education system, I think we would have conquered. Now, I know that the speaker that have just gone before me, perhaps that is where we are going to need his support to just change that. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me when I say arts, culture, and heritage, it is what we need to have it infused in our education system. Arts and culture. If anybody speaks of culture, you're speaking of your identity. We have spoken about the language. Language forms part of that. Our heritage, our children should know, generations, they need to know who we are, what we did, and who they remain to be. In Africa, we are very proud of our heritage. We are very proud of our culture, as you can see. So I'm speaking also as a decade of action. So today you can see that all what I'm wearing here, it is our culture. It is how we, even in fashion, how we showcase ourselves. So it must be part of our daily teachings. Here in Africa, we grow up being taught about who we are, about our clan names, about how we do things, how we behave, how we greet. All those things, they form part of that education that I'm talking about. To identify women who can be able to mentor and coach other women in the rural areas. Now we need role models, we need compassionate teachers. When I say compassionate teachers, Yes, it is good to have the teachers that are qualified. Yes, it is good, and also we appreciate it to have teachers that have gone to college to be qualified. However, there are those people that are compassionate at heart, that are just, it's a gift and it is a burden. It is what they would like to impact the nations or even our societies through just the teaching of life in general. And we find those particularly in our villages. I am the voice of the village, as Ambassador has already spoken as well. To create structures that will involve the women. Here we are talking about our queens. We are talking about the women chiefs. We are talking about the princesses. Yes. And to ensure that there is indigenous or even traditional representation in all levels of society. Here we are talking about businesses, as we have heard. I am the managing director of the businesses as well. And also we make impact and we make difference. And we also involve and even invite the business spaces in the politics, and etc., etc. Point number 6, inclusion of cultural institutions in the ecosystems. Many speakers have already mentioned that. Also in the decision-making table, that is very important. If we are not at the decision-making table, then we are unable to have a voice. We are unable to also influence the decisions that are to be made. Also, how to achieve our sustainable development goals. That is already on the ground. That's what we are doing with Ambassador Andrew through the cultural or even the kingdoms. Have each region focus on each SDG. Let's simplify this process, good people. I believe in simplicity. And therefore make a gradual impact where ultimately when we bring them all together, we will find development and progress. And then we would have achieved goal number 17, which is my favorite, of collaborative efforts of all organizations. So therefore, then we need to use this system to go on to achieve the Agenda 2063. If you agree, you can say yes, 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 and yes, yes. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, and your highnesses, it all depends on us to create the Africa we want to see, enjoying all that she has to offer. We have resources, both above and underneath the land. We have all what we need. Its people are very well diversified in their abilities, in our talents, in all what we bring. Even the people, the indigenous people themselves, they have abilities, they have resources, they have something to offer to the world. And also so that when we collaboratively speak and have their voice, and they are also of influence. So therefore, I would like to say to everybody, let us collaborate, let us work together as we have already started. I would like to see more action. And when we present next year, I would like to see where we are saying the statistics of how each one of us in our regions have made a difference, how we have moved. And therefore, I say to you all, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Highness, Princess Tespi. Thank you very much. Thank you for such an excellent presentation. Moving forward, next, we will have speaking to us on strategy for the global movement of Get on Board for SDG 10-year surge, global campaign and rights of Indigenous community. Speaking to us is Nancy Hanna, executive business consultant all the way in Australia.
Greetings from Sydney, Australia. Thank you for the opportunity to share on this platform. In my presentation, I'll be raising awareness regarding the Indigenous Australians and Torres Strait Islanders. So there are two distinct groups of Indigenous people in Australia. We have the Torres Strait Islanders, who come from the Torres Strait Islands north of Cape York in Queensland. And we also have the Aboriginal people who come from all other parts of Australia. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders make up about 3.3% of Australia's population. 62% of the Indigenous population live outside of Australia's major cities. Some of the major problems confronting Indigenous communities today include health, mental health, education, and social injustice. There is a large health inequality within the Indigenous communities. Aboriginal Australians experience a significantly lower life expectancy and higher levels of disease and disability. The health gap is for the most part a result of unequal access to resources and opportunities necessary for good health, such as income, quality, housing, education, and participation in community activities. The impact of race-based attacks, bias, exclusion, and social undermining, I would say, is also associated with poor mental and physical health. One of the statistics of the Indigenous children show that they experience 1.7 times higher levels of malnutrition than non-Indigenous children. This statistic highlights the health gap within the Indigenous communities. I'm just going to repeat that statistic. So it shows that they experience 1.7 times higher levels. Almost half of Australians experience mental illness at some point in their life, which is a staggering figure. However, amongst the Indigenous communities, the problem is even greater. 5.7% of all deaths within the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities is because of suicide. And if you look at the comparable proportion for non-Indigenous Australians, which sits at about 1.9%, it's a huge contrast. Approximately 24% have reported that they have a mental health or behavioural condition, with a higher rate among females than males. And I just want to note, even with the statistic, this does not take into consideration those that unconsciously or for lack of awareness or understanding report incorrectly. The most common mental health issues within the Indigenous community include anxiety. So anxiety is the most common mental health issue, followed by depression, also psychological distress. All these are common symptoms experienced by the Indigenous communities in Australia. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders also have unhealthy coping behaviours, so they do use illicit drugs and alcohol as their way to numb some pain and also cope. While there is allocated funding to address mental health for these communities in Australia, the way that the funding is currently structured does not guarantee that the most effective therapy modalities are being applied and that the communities are receiving the help that they really need. This would be due to an educational gap from mental health practitioners and also cultural barriers. While you have to be a registered whether you're a counsellor or a psychotherapist in Australia and meet certain requirements to access certain schemes that offer funding for mental health, the mental health industry in Australia, it's not regulated. And that does and can cause a problem. So about 62% of Indigenous students finish year 12. So year 12 is the highest year when you graduate out of high school. And that's in comparison to 86% of non-Indigenous Australians. Although this has improved over the years, it's still a significant gap. The employment to population rate for the Indigenous people is about 48% compared to 75% for non-Indigenous Australians. Again, it's quite a significant gap. Australian government has committed to increasing participation in early childhood education. It's committed to improving school attendance. It's also committed to improving reading, writing, numeracy, and making sure that students finish school in order to help close the gap. However, there is still a gap in other educational outcomes that still need to be addressed. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people are hugely overrepresented in the Australian criminal justice system. So just to give you an idea, Indigenous people in prison is 15 times greater than the non-Indigenous population. Over 40% of total custodies are for public drunkenness or good order offences. This indicates that the extent to which routine policing is directed at the handling of petty offences, and also the extent to which detention in police cells seems to be the routine method of dealing with so many of these offences. Aboriginals are detained about 27 times the rate of non-Aboriginals in Australia. So you can see that it's a massive issue. Indigenous people accounted for 22% of all deaths in prison custody. Just keeping in mind that the Indigenous community represents about 3.3% of the total Australian population. So the number is quite high. Some of the sustainable development goals that should be in the forefront include culturally appropriate education, informed and effective participation, the security of Indigenous people's rights to territories, lands and natural resources, health, including and addressing mental health. For Australia to overcome Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander disadvantages and reach the SDGs, it will require transformation of current policies and practices. Australians need to listen to the voices of the people that make up their Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. These Sustainable Development Goals, if successfully executed, will see progress and contribute to closing the gap that exists within the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. This concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Nancy, for that wonderful presentation and for giving us those statistics. I didn't know half of those stuff that you've given there. See, that's the interesting here. We learn a lot when we come to places like this. And we have speakers from all parts of the world educating us and bringing their perspectives towards these matters at hand. Once again, thank you very much. Speaking to us next will be, as well, speaking to us on the Get On Board for SDG 10-year search. We have His Excellency Lord Robert Orville Thomas, Attorney General, International Consulting Cabinet for WULMI. His Royal Highness, Lord Thomas, over to you, sir.
A pleasant good day to everyone once again. It's a delight and a pleasure to be here. I don't know, where do we start? There has been so many excellent presentations, and I think everybody has highlighted what the problems are. I think everyone has been able to pinpoint how the indigenous, I will not just talk about indigenous people, but I will then go and talk about the indigenous rights. And yes, from the very inception, since 1887, it was highlighted that there was a need to respect the values of what culture represented versus what law or legislation represented. And unfortunately, close to 100 years later, or more than 100 years, we still see that the same systematic problem keep repeating itself. So rather than me focusing on these statistics, I would like to focus, like Her Highness Princess Tepsi said, Agenda 2063, rather than just Agenda 2030. And my reason for saying this is because we know the statistics. I mean, from the origin of highlighting the importance of indigenous rights, get to action, do something, from that very set time, a lot has taken place. One of my favorite writers, Louis Henkin, he said that, unfortunately, the view of multinationals oversees the rights of indigenous people, and therefore they prostitute themselves with legislators in order to obtain what they want. That case is not just true to Africa. And in as much as I am a Pan-African, I can say that I've seen that what is known as the Kansas nations, and that stands for Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and US, they were the last people to vote. In fact, in 1982, when it was brought to the board by the Social Reporter study by Jose Ricardo Martinez Cobo, when that was brought up, these four countries refused to sign the actual Declaration of Indigenous People, much less to talk about the Declaration of Indigenous Right. So my main concern is here, it's all well and good, and I'm coming from the point of call to action. I have statistics which will bore you. As Dr. Joel said, we were there on the ground with him, alongside with Professor Judy Thomas, and we saw all of the things that have been highlighted. Poverty, number one. Poverty eradication has been a subject for the past 40 years. I remember when there was a target of the Window 2040, which they were trying to achieve in certain regions. I find it amazing that it's still, as a statistics, that it says that 70% of the deprived community lives within Asia and the Southern Pacific Islands. Fortunately, in my experience, I have seen that that's not necessarily the case, because the truth can be said about places like Paraguay, places like Ecuador, places like Colombia, places like Brazil, where there is a high index of a lack of education. So if the goal was poverty eradication by education, then it brings me to one question: what has gone wrong? I heard one of my predecessors mention Global Compact. Fantastic. But unfortunately, Global Compact is a conglomeration of businessmen, and their setups for me are great, but I haven't seen the actual help reaching the people. What has been highlighted from Professor Thomas, by Ms. Nancy, by everyone, is that there continues to be a disparity between what the agendas has set out. There continues to be a lack of productivity. So in as much as there is a lot of activity, there is not sufficient productivity. And if we are to measure it, can we say that over the last decade, since we have been talking about Agenda 21, what has really taken place? Okay, let's take one example, the Maori people. They have been recognized to say that they have an issue in New Zealand. But in legislation, what has changed? Or let's look at Canada. If we're going to talk about a call for action, or let's look at some of the areas that are not mentioned. For example, there is more focus on polygamy among Indigenous people than actually health long-term solutions. One of the writers that put this in context in 2015 says that it's amazing how they focus, her name is Elena Glaskava, they focus on the issues that were trivial as opposed to the future. Another great writer for me was a person that wrote from Nepal, Niraj Prakash Joshi, mentioning that there has not been any significant development over the past 6 years, despite budget review annually. So if we look now at the incarceration problems, well, where do we start? Canada has the highest incarceration rates for the actual, if you want to call them Aborigines or Indigenous people. Why is that? The mortality rate is on an increase. Since 2016, the mortality rate in Canada has gone up by 37%, but particularly within the Indigenous community. So it brings me to the question, is it just about the Indigenous people, or is it about the UN Declaration of Indigenous Rights for Indigenous people, which is two separate things? And is only up until recent 2013, when John Ruggie had to go to the UN and make it a mandatory position to say, I cannot impose, I cannot demand for us to have Indigenous rights as a legislation, but what we can have is corporate social responsibility. And by his work is when, for the first time, the Assembly realized that nothing had been done before that was sustainable. Don't get me wrong, there were actions, but they weren't long-term sustainable goals. And I could highlight the 8 key issues. Agenda 2030 has 167 targets, of which I am actually wondering, are we really going to get to even 50% of that between now and the next, we are in 2020, 10 years? Are we really going to do that? So my call will be a call of a personal vow to a demand of legacy on ourselves, a demand of legacy on what am I gonna leave for tomorrow's world to find? You see, the responsibility of the planet does not stop with a mentality that says, I will enjoy today and whatever happens after I'm gone is irrelevant. That has been the key issue. If we talk about some of the countries in Africa, anytime I've sat down with some of the leadership, the main problem I encounter is short-term vision. I am going to grab what I can get now, and it doesn't matter what happens tomorrow. Well, it's nothing different to some of the people that have had the chance. So if I can ask us one thing, rather than debate, pontificate, question, or have critiques about it, let's set out a formula where we all have our own personal target agenda of what we have done. One of the presenters said earlier to the initiative of His Royal Highness Prince Nikolai, what one man can do. I will include you women, what one woman can do, what many women can do. And I will say what we all together can do. much has been said. I had my slides to talk about all the different angles, but I want to make it, if my duty is to actually call for action, then let me ask the question, what are our action plans? Is this the statistics that has been given to us, or what we are going to change? And how frequently do we measure those changes? How constantly do we review that changes are being implemented? What are the regions? I mean, if it's fundraising, let's talk about it, which tends to be the number one problem. Well, I used to think so, that fundraising was the main problem, until I realized that there are budgets. I was talking to Chief Reagan, who is head of 80% of the native tribes, let me not use the word, indigenous tribes in the United States. And Chief Reagan was saying to me just 10 days ago, he said, Justice, I don't get it. I want you to work with our local courts, because for the past 30 years that I have been appointed a chief, he said, there are budgets in Nevada, there are budgets in Arizona, there are budgets in Montana, there are budgets in several states, but none of them have actually 90% reach the people that are most in need. What is the problem? What is going on? He actually showed me a case study where he went to question the Supreme Court, where they had stated that they were in receipt of $1 million every single year for the past 20 years. And when they checked the receiving account, not the budget stated account, the receiving account showed only $980,000 in 20 years. So I will conclude by saying, can we become really our brother's keeper? Indigenous people are all of us. Indigenous rights are the rights of every single one of us to our freedom. And in any area or place where there is disparity, where there is lack of balance and justice, let us try and bring legislation, cooperation, more than anything else, cooperation amongst the different groups, because you see, you can direct, but if you have cooperation, it's better. I believe in legislation by cooperation as opposed to by demand. And let's see, by having a self-imposed accountability, how much, when we speak next year, as Princess said, what would we be able to report that we, as a group that are here today, has been able to achieve? I conclude with that to say, let the action begin. I'd rather do more talking with my action than with my words. Have a great day, everybody.
Video for everyone here to watch. Go ahead with the video, Tony.
Not be flocked like sheep. To those with unskilled eyes, to those eyes who know the truth is uncivilized. Hello to those unhypnotized, hello to those unblind, uncompromised, to the few awake while the masses sleep, those who cannot be flocked like sheep, to those with unskilled eyes, to those who clearly see the lies, unable to be mesmerized, who know the truth is uncivilized, and consciousness cannot be commercialized because it can't be verbalized. To those who will not apologize, to those who know where freedom lies, and that existence cannot be actualized, and insight doesn't see with eyes. To those who cannot be indoctrinated in this world overpopulated with fear of independent thought, where they do not question lessons taught, where gain remains unrealized. Hello to those unhypnotized. I know your peace and your plight, to walk amongst the blind with sight. I wish I could go back to sleep. I wish I didn't know the things I know that my mind forces me to keep. I wish I could be like them and find the value in the dividends and blissfulness to live for the weekend. To to believe in fairy tales, and that submissive people win, and that the sky is filled with pies. But I am forced to realize, forced to remain awake, unhypnotized.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much to you as well, Judge Thomas. Thank you. Thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. Thank you for showing us and calling us out on not just talking, but action. Action, action, action. We have a lot of talk, and then action. The people, I know folks usually say, put your money where your mouth is. Well, a lot of people, they don't want to participate in that because they're not sure. But here today, we have a lot of our speakers here today. They are people who will put their money to where their mouth is, so they will do the work, and they have been doing the work, an exceptional job. With that being said, I'm just going to go over, because we are at the end of the program now, so I'm just going to go over 2 or 3 questions. I know some folks put a few questions, but this question is from Abdulaziz for Dr. Judith. From your experience, so Dr. Judith, if you could unmute your mic, you'll be answering this question. From your experience, what is the best way business can come into Indigenous communities to develop joint business to create jobs, the upskilling of skills, and providing opportunities for the growth of such communities? Before you answer, Dr. Judith, if anyone else would like to chime in, any one of the other panelists would like to chime in to answer any of the questions, please do. But let's try and keep it very concise as possible as we're trying to wrap up in the next few minutes. Dr. Judith.
Unfortunately, because the chiefs run the communities, it's difficult to go through without going through them. You would have to contact one of the chiefs of each community in order to, the chief and council, in order for anyone to do anything or to even try to do any business, or even if it's to help them, you'd have to communicate with them first.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Ed. I think that is, she has nailed it, which is true. That is why I was even saying calling on those, because we being the voice and all that, but we are not acting as a limitation, but we are inviting. So what happens is that within the municipalities, I don't know how does it work in other regions. In South Africa here, within our municipalities, there is the social development, there is the economic development as well. That is where also the chiefs around those municipalities are factored in to have a seat and to have a voice and to also have a representation. Beyond that, we usually go in with the businesses where we ask them for their social responsibility, whether funds or anything that they can offer, and we become the facilitators to implement that on their behalf or with them as well. And that it sits within the marketing department usually. And then besides that as well, we have the businesses where they come together to give funding. And they always look for organized group of people or an organization that can partner with them, take accountability and responsibility. So that's how we do, where we really have open doors as Indigenous, as the cultural institutions, to say, let us work together. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. This question is for Dr. Joel. Dr. Joel, this question is for you from Bill Graham. So Dr. Joel, you pointed out the need for incomes and the dependencies of good incomes on education. Should Indigenous children be given a world-class education that would enable them to compete in world markets in whatever profession they want? Before you answer, he says, history has shown that education is a key factor of youth migrating away from smaller remote communities, usually tradition-oriented, toward centers of opportunities for particular professions, including rural Europe, UK, and US, Indigenous communities would be strongly impacted. So the question again, the question is, should Indigenous children be given a world-class education that would enable them to compete in world markets in whatever profession they want? Dr. Joel, you can unmute your mic and respond.
Okay. I think this the Indigenous people have direct lower direitos,
Rights.
right of to decide if, for example, in South America, if he wanted to stay inside your original community and to live in traditional form. But if the Indian people, the children, do want to get improved, to know about the European Occidental culture, or another one, China culture, he have a right of to get this condition. I think that the white civilization or another one that to get the power, for example, in Australia, New Zealand, or Canada, must to give the opportunity the Indian people decided your future, and give the opportunity of to get a good education. For example, to explore the forest, for example, mineral reserves. Many regions in the world, in Canada or in the Amazon forest, have a rich minerals, and the Indian people, many times can't to access this rich, the wealth. The solution, I think, is possible relationship between nations or multilateral organizations to unite, to get as forces to provide this for the special Indian community. I think many initiatives can to start if we have a union between us, the specialists or leaders that to know about the question, preocupação seria the worries about this special theme, the
special subject.
It's important to start with a primary education.
With primary
das crianças.
The primary education, the infants education.
To give the ferramentas, seriam
to give tools.
Yes.
To give the tools in order to the children.
To the children, for the children to have the conditions for to improve it. And in this special moment, COVID-19, as the technology ways so important for to give these opportunities. And Canada have a very, very interesting initiative about telemedicine, telemedicine with the Indian people. Some Canadian people from the health minister years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, come to Amazon region and to show this special technology about telemedicine that can to use for the teleeducation. Maybe Judith can explain about this project. If I don't know if it's in action, is em funcionamento.
It is still working.
It is still working in Canada, but I think that we together can to ask, for example, technologies companies, Microsoft, Apple, and in China's industry, for example, give the support to
develop this project.
Para doar, por exemplo, doação, donate, for to donate equipamentos,
donation,
instruments for to do this, to make this, okay? Ideias are common in the world, and we think is so integrative.
To integrate.
In Africa, in Australia, the vision is the same.
The situation is the same.
And now we need to start the practice together.
To put it to practice.
Okay, this is my contribution.
Thank you very much, Dr. Joel. Thank you very much. Okay, so one last question for the panelists. There's questions in. I noticed that some of the panelists are already answered the questions out in the chat. For Lord Thomas.
Yes, sir.
The question is, how does one join your Action for Results movement?
Right. I have set out a number of action plans for the next 3 decades. I was inspired by a man called Freddie Youssef, who in 2008, he invited me to Kuwait. And I was amazed to see that the plan for Kuwait and the region was not for the next 5 or 10 years. They had a 50-year plan for energy, development, structure, and at the core of it, they had education. I will be working in conjunction with Dr. Ada, Dr. Bannister, and many of the panelists that are on this team. For the sake of protocol, I will ask that everything is directed through them, and we will have a number of initiatives post-COVID-19. Hopefully we don't have COVID-21 or 22 or anything of the sort, but whichever one it is, even if it's COVID-25, we will still be planning post that era with the same vision, 40 to 50 years ahead. Where would we be? And what other measures do we have in place? And if you would like to join, please refer your details to Dr. Bannister and Dr. Ada, and invite will be coming out as to the different actions we will be doing. Dr. Joel, you're not alone. We're coming back out there to see you. Professor Judy, we will be up in Canada too with yourself. And we will be down there in Australia. And so gear up yourself, get ready, and have all the preparations by the time it comes. COVID helps you to plan. You've had enough time to pack the bags, save up the money. You don't have where to go and spend it. So actually there's some positive to look at it, and we can start by doing something. And let me answer this without taking too much time. There are different ways you can participate, directly or indirectly. You may not be able to fly, but you can help somebody fly there. You might not be able to buy a book like His Royal Highness is doing. He's buying a number of books. How about giving to someone like Dr. Joel about 100 books every month for primary and secondary education for the local people? How about sending something to support what is going to help there? And one of my plans to answer you, where money is concerned, is total transparency. I don't like taking money. I rather the accountant hold it, and I invoice the accountant. That way there is no headache. That's part of the plan. That's part of the policy. Hope I've answered you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. All right, so we are winding down to the last. to the end of the program. At this time, I would like to ask Her Excellency Ambassador Dr. Ada Okika to give us our summary and just a brief reflection, and then we will have the final remarks.
Thank you, Dr. Bannister. It has been an interesting program, educative, informative, with all the speakers from different regions. We have from Africa, from Australia, from Brazil, from America, from Canada, from South Africa. Oh, wow. And it's been interesting to hear from all of you on this great initiative. And we also have from Europe with the Prince of Siboga also speaking. A lot has been said with regards to the rights of indigenous people. We also refer to some of the messages and statements from the United Nations regarding the indigenous people. And that's very, very pertinent to know that the decade of action is not just talking. It's not just presentation of speeches, theories, but is a decade of calling for unstoppable movement of action. Unstoppable movement of action to ensure that no one is left behind. And it is this import that has made us to think of reaching out to indigenous people. My organization has done a lot on SDG 4 and its target, inclusive, quality and inclusive education for lifelong learning. And we have considered greatly about the indigenous people. Just as someone said, the indigenous people have rights. The children is not just trying to give them a world-class education. It is their right to full-fledged quality and inclusive education. So the idea of addressing education, action hinging on all, and having a call to action on leave no one behind is also very, very important and pertinent to understand that the issue about the indigenous rights of indigenous people to education is a global action. It's a pertinent issue to achieving the decade of action. They have had a lot of conferences, a lot of resolutions, which we can't have time to share them here, right from United Nations and even establishing People of Indigenous Forum. These are also steps, but the far remain is, just as His Excellency Lord Thomas has said, action, carrying them along, supporting them, even when money are given, even when resources are provided. How do they reach out to the indigenous people and ensure that they are partakers of those resources? When you hear more about rights of indigenous people, you just believe with me that what His Excellency Lord Thomas pointed is just an iceberg of what they are passing through. But the unstoppable movement of action is needed through initiatives and campaigns and practical actions to get all issues of concern on indigenous community on board. The global ascending to the Get on Board for SDG 10-year surge and commitment to promoting the decade of action on quality and inclusive education for lifelong learning for the community of indigenous people, while continuing to building human capacity, including development, targeted measures for the aforementioned action plans, strategies and measures in collaboration with this indigenous community is very, very vital, especially now of the decade of action. When you take back to almost 5 years gone of the SDG 2030 agenda, you see that not action, not much improvement have done in these communities, except individual efforts, spirited efforts, and the doctor from Canada mentioned her efforts during the COVID era for the indigenous people. So it has been much recognized through indigenous effort. And that was why the Prince Nicholas took its reign to launch his global humanitarian campaign on Get On Board for SDG 10-year surge. Now, what is this campaign going to do? We've heard about mentioning of campaigns, enacting more actions, exchange programs, development of action, getting people on board to make sure that help is included to an action to programs that are action-oriented. And more importantly, enacting curriculum that can get everyone on board, giving them more resources, like His Excellency Denis Antoine's books, getting them all, starting from the children to get them understand what the decade of action is talking about. This is very important because in most countries, most people don't know anything in detail. They don't know anything about the SDGs and the decade of action. So these resources, more books should be given out, more attention should be given out, more education, more awareness for people to actually understand what the decade of action is all about. I was talking to an indigenous person 2 nights ago about this. He said that but the book has nothing to do with children. The children are too young to start understanding about it. I said, but what do you mean by being young? Once a child is in school, he has the opportunity. He has the opportunity to learn, to acquire knowledge of all sorts. But it depends on the language, on how you break down the language for the child to understand. So quality and inclusive education has no age limit. No, and that's exactly what the Get On Board, the book by His Excellency, has just defined, getting all children on board for the SDG. Now, one most important about SDG is that it's so inclusive that it is explorative, it expands their horizon when you get to know the knowledge. If you are a student in the college and you read the book, it is giving you an eye-opener to opportunities and knowledge. And if you are working and in business, it's also giving you an eye-opener. So the book is so explanative and illustrative. And more important, the book is also adopted by the United Nations. And that is why we are not relenting of giving out these books. So the people of indigenous people are not going to be left behind in this book. And I thank the Prince for launching this campaign, Get On Board. So we will advance the campaign by enacting action for global exchange program and designing digital education with the Principality of Siboga Digital University. Digital education on that campaign, especially on quality and inclusive education, in partnership with the Digital University of the Principality of Siboga. So I encourage everyone. I have discussed with my sister from South Africa, and we are in agreement to have collaboration to design programs that can bring in women, children, students, youth of indigenous community. One thing is for you to understand your environment, understand your situation. And that is why the Prince had mentioned about the 5 Ps, using the people who are the people of indigenous community, the planet of indigenous environment, igniting action to enable partnership and prosperity to prosper the community. So that by the time we are talking about 10-year surge, we are also trying to set up a machinery, a train of an unstoppable action to ensure that every issue concerned on the rights of indigenous people to education are equally achieved within the 10-year surge. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ada. Thank you very much. At this time, I want to take the time to say thank you very much to all of our speakers. Thank you very much, Dr. Joel D'Souza, who is the UN physician, United Nations Medical Service, New York. Thank you very much to Professor Dr. Judith Thomas, Dr. Godfrey Nenji, Her Highness Princess Tespi, His Serene Highness Prince Nikolai I for the Principality of Suburga, Nancy Hanna, the Executive Business Consultant in Australia, His Excellency Lord Robert Orville Thomas. Thank you very much to you too, sir. His Excellency Ambassador Dennis Antoine, the Chair Advisory Board for Center for SDG Global. And to you as well, Dr. Ada, thank you very much for your dedication, your contributions, and for sharing your knowledge here with all of us today. And to you, our viewers here on the Zoom call, as well as those of you watching us live via Facebook, whichever part of the world you are, thank you very much for being a part of this event with us today. We hope that every information that was given, that you will take it, you will run with it. We have multiple organizations represented here today. You can feel free to reach out to us, and we can be, so that we can be able to partner and work together to become agents of change, so that we can be able as well to help our Indigenous brothers and sisters around the world to get the rightful education, health, as well as business minds that they need, and the exposure that they need, so that they of themselves can gain the rights that they are due, just like you and I, who are here walking freely in the open. So once again, thank you very much to each and everyone, and thanks again to our viewers live on Facebook around the world. It has been a pleasure serving you today. I am His Excellency Ambassador Dr. Devon Bannister. I am the president and founder of MACBAN Arts, and as well as I'm one of the ambassadors to the United Nations representing WULMAI. Thank you very much to each and every one of you. And to our panelists once again, thank you, thank you, thank you. This brings us to the end of our meeting. Thank you all.
Hello to those unhypnotized. Hello, those unblind and compromised. To the few awake while the masses sleep. Those who cannot be flocked like sheep. To those with unskilled eyes. To those who clearly see the lies. Unable to be mesmerized. Who know that truth is uncivilized. And consciousness cannot be commercialized because it can't be verbalized. To those who will not apologize. To those who know where freedom lies. And that existence cannot be actualized. And insight doesn't see with eyes. To those who cannot be indoctrinated. In this world overpopulated with fear of independent thought, where they do not question lessons taught, where game remains unrealized. Hello to those unhypnotized. I know your peace and your plight, to walk amongst the blind with sight. I wish I could go back to sleep. I wish I didn't know the things I know that my mind forces me to keep. I wish I could be like them and find the value in the dividends and blissfulness to live for the weekend. To believe in fairy tales and that submissive people win. And that the sky is filled with pies. But I am forced to realize, forced to remain awake, unhypnotized.